your mic. This is your water. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm impressed by the number of people showing up for this. I hope I will give you a good, entertaining, intellectual show, which is not an easy task, but given the size of the audience, it would be a big blow to myself if I wouldn't be able to entertain you at least decently well. So again, thank you very much. And the title that I have chosen for this speech is historical patterns and tendencies in Austro-libertarian perspective. That is, I want to tell you a few stories, so to speak, that explain the present world. And the story consists of three sub-stories. They are all interconnected, run in a way parallel, but I will present them, of course, in a sequence. First one, then the second, then the third, and they will complement each other to come up with a full picture that makes you hopefully better understand the present world. The first story, or nowadays people call that the first narrative, concerns the origin of states and the changes of states, or the constitutions of states, in the course of time. It is like a historical reconstruction. And the second story concerns the concentration of states, deals with the issues of war and imperialism. And the third story that then completes the full picture deals with money and banking and monetary centralization. So let me begin with the first. I will read you one page from one of my works that explains the very foundations of libertarianism, the very principles of libertarianism, and then I will, in a more loose way, continue from there. If there were no scarcity in this world, there would be no conflicts among people. But there is scarcity. Since we left the Garden of Eden, things are scarce. And because things are scarce, we might fight over things. I want to do one thing with a certain object, and you might want to do something else with the same object. So if we want to live in peace with each other, it is necessary that all scarce things are in the hands of separate individuals. That is, we need private property in order to avoid conflicts, such that I own certain things and I can do what I want with those things. And you own other things and you do whatever you want to do with those things. This is the only solution in order to avoid conflict, unless there would exist a perfect harmony of all interests. That is, everybody wants everybody else to do exactly what he expects them to do. But obviously we do not live in such a world. In a world where we have different ideas of what should be done, what makes us happy or unhappy, we need private property in order to do what we want without coming into conflict with other people. And then the question is, how do we decide who owns what and who doesn't own what? And the libertarian answer to this is, the first thing is, of course, everybody is the owner of his or her own physical body. You can do with your body what you want. I can do with my body what I want. I don't interfere with your body, and you don't interfere with mine. With regard to external things, in order not to get into conflict, the rule to acquire property, private property, is he who is the very first one to appropriate something that was previously unowned becomes the owner of it. Because only the first one can obviously appropriate these things without running into conflict. The second one cannot do that. If it is already appropriated by one, then the second one, if he wants to appropriate the same things, would run into conflict. And then, of course, property can be passed on by voluntary agreements. I can pass on what I have originally appropriated to you, and you can pass on whatever you have appropriated to the next person. Those are very simple rules, intuitively sensible, and that is, by and large, the libertarian program. That's how we acquire private property, and that's how we can avoid conflicts. Even if we follow these rules by and large, we have, of course, people who break the rules. People who steal property or do not rely on me passing property on to them, but take it without my consent. So what do we do about rule breakers? And as long as mankind is what it is, we will have rule breakers. Who decides when rules are broken, these rules are broken, who is right and wrong? Who becomes the judge, the arbiter? Now imagine that somebody would propose, I have the solution how we solve this problem. In every case of conflict, including conflicts involving myself, I am the one to decide who is right and who is wrong. Would I have any chance that anybody would accept this rule? And I would guess that nobody would ever accept a rule like this, because everybody would know what will happen then. If that were the rule, that meant basically I could initiate a conflict with you, I could steal something from you, I could hit you on the head if I want to, and then you complain about this. Why did you steal something from me? Why did you hit me on the head? And I would say, I'm the one who is the ultimate decision maker in this case. And that was, of course, entirely justified that I did this. So obviously, such a rule would be considered to be ridiculous. Now, you realize, of course, that this is precisely what states everywhere in the world do. That is, they can initiate a conflict, they can expropriate you, they can break these simple rules that I initially explained, and then if you complain about it, who decides who is right and wrong? A judge who is an employee of the state. So the question is then, how did such a crazy institution such as a state become possible? Something that on the face of it makes no sense whatsoever. And I want to just reconstruct how such a thing was possible. Initially, during the period of the Middle Ages or so, people went with their conflicts that they had with each other to what we might call aristocrats or nobles. You would not choose as judges somebody who has no influence, who is not respected by the rest of the people, because ultimately you have to enforce the verdict that the judge makes. And only if you have prominent, successful people that are respected by the public will you be able that your verdict will also be enforced, that people accept this is a right judgment and this is the way we solve this problem. And there was not just one person or one institution to which you could go for the resolution of your conflicts, but there were several ones. Several prominent people, aristocrats, whatever, people with great respect from which you could choose. And there was nobody who was the ultimate judge. Even if you had a judge that made such and such a decision, his word was not the final and last word. You could always go to somebody else. And everybody, all judges, were considered to be under the same law. Nobody had a monopoly position in this. You could always go higher. You could go to the king, you could go appeal to the Pope, and even the Pope was not the ultimate decision maker, because popes could also lose their position. So there was competition in the job of being judges to decide how conflicts should be handled. A big step then occurred, and the most decisive step occurred when one of these voluntarily chosen judges, competing for respect against other judges, elevated himself to the position of being the monopoly judge. My word is the final word, and there is no appeal beyond my decision. Nobody is above me. My decision is the final decision, and that is it. This we would call an absolute king. He eliminates all his potential competitors, all the other nobles, judges that you could previously appeal to if you were not happy with the first decision as it was made. How did they get away with that? On the one hand, they got away with it by bribing some of the other of their competing judges by saying, okay, I'll give you a subordinate position in my court. And the other thing that they said is talking to the people, general public and saying, look, you might have certain obligations and contracts with other people that you regret that you did them, and I will free you of these obligations. And so they got public support for this move of competing judges to a situation where you had one monopoly judge. Historically, this process took several hundred years. It started in the late 16th and early 17th century, where states were formed, while previously there existed no such thing as a state. There existed competing centers of authority, but no ultimate authority. So several hundred years were necessary for some people to reach this position as ultimate judge. Now, and then you have two institutions that emerged as soon as you had reached this position. The first institution was, now all of a sudden taxes are imposed on people. Previously, even the richest nobles and so forth had to ask their underlings to agree to taxes. And if they didn't agree to it, there were no taxes. Now, however, since you are the monopolist, you can say, okay, you owe me such and such. And if people protested, they said, look, I'm the ultimate judge, and I tell you, you owe me this. That's it. And if you don't do what I tell you, you will be punished for it. And the second thing that happened is, for the first time, we had then something that we call legislation. Prior to this, laws were not made. Laws were considered something that are discovered and applied to everyone in exactly the same way. These laws that I mentioned at the very beginning, how property is established, these were not laws that were made up by somebody. These are natural laws. Natural in the sense, if you want to avoid conflict, then these are the natural laws. They cannot be any different, otherwise you will run into conflict. But now you have, with absolute kings established, you have a situation where you can make laws, invent laws. You must do such and such. You have to have such and such obligation. So taxation and legislation come into existence. First, of course, to a small extent, there won't be not massive taxation, and there will not be massive amount of legislation, but slowly, taxation will start and taxes will be increased, and slowly, laws will be made. And of course, the laws will always be made in such a way that they benefit the ruler and his entourage that he assembles around him. And then the next step in the development, bringing us closer to the present time, is now, of course, the position of the king is attacked by various people, mostly by the intellectuals. They say, yeah, but isn't that a violation of the principle of equality before the law if there is one guy, the king, that can make laws? Isn't he a privileged person? Are there now not two types of laws? The laws that apply to regular people and the laws that apply to the king. He is above the law that applies to regular people. And that has to go. That is a violation of the principles of justice. And what was the answer to this? The answer to that was to say what we have to do is we have to make it possible that everybody can become the king. That is, we introduce democracy. Not just the king should have this right to do that, everybody should have the right to do this. Everybody should be able to become the king, so to speak. The question, however, is, did this step involve that all people did become equal before the law? And the answer is no, of course not. A democratically elected president or prime minister or whatever the name is of these people, he can do the same thing as a king could do before. There is two types of laws still exist. One type of law is what we call private law that applies to everybody in their private dealings. And the other type of law, which we would not even call law, is what is termed public law. Public law is the law that protects and applies to people who have been democratically elected to be the head of the state. So, two types of laws exist under democracy, just as much as two types of laws existed under an absolute king. Now, what did this change from monarchy to democracy imply? And again, indicating roughly how that was, when that happened historically, the beginning of this process is with the French Revolution, where monarchy is first, so to speak, come under heavy attack. And the end process is, at least as far as Western Europe is concerned, is the end of World War I, when essentially all monarchies are abolished and democracy becomes the principle of organization for all Western societies. Now, what this transition means is the following. Somebody like the king, who considers his country, his private property and all the people living there as his tenants, is replaced by a temporary administrator. The king could sell part of his realm and he could pass it on to future generations. He had what we might call a low time preference because of this. That is, a long planning horizon, precisely because he considered himself as, I'm some sort of owner of this whole thing. A democratically elected politician in charge of the state does not consider himself to be the owner of the place, but a temporary administrator of it. He cannot sell anything and keep the receipts from the sale for himself, and he cannot pass it on to the next generation. Will that make a difference in the way that he conducts his business? And the answer is yes, that will make a tremendous difference. I always try to explain that to my students by giving him the following example. Imagine that you own a house. You can pass it on as an inheritance. You can sell the house and so forth. Or you have the same house, and for 4 years you can do with the house whatever you want to do with the house, but you cannot pass it on, and you cannot sell it and keep the receipts from the sale. Will you treat the house the same way? And the answer is no, of course you will not treat the house the same way. If you are just a temporary caretaker of it, you will try to get as much out of the house in as short a time as possible, because after 4 or 5 years, you might no longer be in charge of it, and the house might then be a ruin. Would you do the same thing if you were the owner of the house? And the answer is, that's very unlikely that you would do that. I'm not excluding that. There are sometimes crazy people in the world. Actually, there are very many crazy people in the world. But it is far less likely that people would do that if they own the place. So, democracy is a system that leads to systematic capital consumption. That is, people consume in the present because they do not know in what position they will be in the future, instead of accumulating capital and making long-run plans. There's another thing that I should mention. In democracy, because people are elected, you might say, isn't it better to have competition in who is the ruler than having no competition if you have a king running the country? And the answer here is, no, competition is good when it concerns the production of goods. That is, the production of things that people want. But competition is not good when it concerns things that are evil, things that people do not want. People do not ask to be taxed. They will not scream, hey, tax me, tax me, tax me, I love to be taxed. They do not ask, make another law that benefits you and harms me. They are afraid of this. But since states are in the business of taxing and legislating, that is, doing bad things, doing evil things, competition in that area is bad. You don't want competition in who is the best killer, who is the best person to run a concentration camp. There you would be happy if you have incompetent people, stupid people, people who are inefficient. But democracy precisely produces that the biggest demagogues, the biggest crooks will rise to the top. Imagine that you would run a campaign and would say, hey, I want private property to be protected under all circumstances. I don't want to have any taxes. I don't want to have any redistribution of income and wealth and so forth. We have to stop passing any laws except the principles that I mentioned at the very beginning. How successful would you be in a campaign like this? The answer, you will not be very successful. Because democracy, of course, allows people also to use their vote to vote themselves the property of other people. In the history of political thought, you will find practically no one who ever promoted democracy until very recently. But in the past, everybody realized democracy is a way of people who have less or have nothing to vote themselves the property of those people who have more and are better off than they themselves are. It promotes immorality. democracy might work in very small villages, because there everybody knows who the other people are. You know, Mr. X is a nice guy, and Mr. Y is a lousy person. And you would be ashamed to try to rob other people of their property because people know each other. But if you have states that are made up of millions and millions of people, you don't know whom you rob. So the inhibition that you otherwise have against stealing from other people simply disappears. One word about, can kings also be evil? Yes, they can be evil. But because they inherit their position, they are not elected to their position, they also might be sometimes nice people. Democratic leaders cannot be nice people because they are the result of elections, of competition among them. All right. So this is the first story, how states evolve and how the structure, the constitution of states has changed in the course of whatever 1,000 years. Now I come to the second story, which in a way complements the first, makes the picture more complete than the picture that I developed up to this point. In a situation where we have no state, of course there are also fights and warlike activities going on among different groups and so forth, different gangs, different families fighting each other. It was not a situation where everything was absolutely peaceful and wonderful and marvelous. But before the development of the state, whenever you engaged in aggression against other people or some groups fighting other groups, you had to pay the cost of being an aggressor yourself. To aggress against other people is also not costless. You must have means to do it, you must have money to do it, you must have weapons to do it, you must have people who side with you and so forth, and yet you might have to pay to fight on your side. So you would always think, if I go into some conflict with others, fight other people, I always have to consider how costly will that be for me? Will I win? Will I lose? And so forth. As soon as you have the institution of the state, war making becomes a different enterprise. Because now you can make other people pay for your aggression and your aggressive motives that you have towards other people. Again, recall, you can resort to taxes. People must pay for your war that might not want to have anything to do with it. Imagine that, let's say, Mr. Bush, when he started his wars in the Middle East or so, would have had to pay for this war himself and recruit his buddies and friends and say, are you willing to chip in for this war? Well, he might have found a few people who would have chipped in. But would all Americans have said, hey, wonderful, great idea, here you have my money, go ahead, do it? And the answer is, no, millions of people would have said, but what do I have to do with these people in Iraq? What do I have to do with the people in Afghanistan? It's your war, pay for your war, but leave us out of it. So the likelihood of wars increases dramatically as soon as you can externalize the cost of it onto people who are actually not interested in that whole thing at all. Now, if states go to war against other states, and they do more likely, as I said, than private people go to warlike activities. Then the question is, of course, who tends to win these wars? And also realize immediately that wars are eliminative competition between states. That is, on every territory, there can only be one monopolist of taxation and legislation. You cannot have on the same territory different organizations that legislate and that tax. Every state on his territory is the only one that can do it. And of course, every state has an interest to expand its territory. The more people he controls, that means the more people he can tax. The more people he can impose his own laws on those people. So then the question comes, who will win these types of wars? Now, obviously, very small states will not likely go to war against very big states because they know they will lose it. But assume states of roughly equal size and roughly equal numbers of people. And there we discover some sort of paradox. Obviously, all wars require resources. Weapons, soldiers, ammunitions, logistical materials, and so forth. Now, the longer a war draws out, the more important it becomes how wealthy is the society on which this state or that state can get his resources. And the interesting thing is that we discover there is, it is the more liberal states, liberal in the European sense, that is being not quite as nasty as some other states, that those states, of course, command larger resources. Because more liberal societies are wealthier societies. They allow more capital accumulation, they allow people more to become wealthy and so forth. So there is a tendency that might strike you as paradoxical, that the more liberal, the nicer states, so to speak, are those that tend to be the most aggressive, the most imperialistically minded states in the course of history. As you have first a country like the Netherlands, for instance, being the first really successful capitalist society that becomes a major colonial power. Then that position goes to England. Again, a very liberal country, a very wealthy country, becoming a world-dominating place, with places controlled by Britain all around the globe. And then that position is finally inherited by the United States, beginning with World War I and culminating with the end of World War II, when the United States, because it is by far the wealthiest country, is also the one that has the largest empire that was ever assembled. Another word about war and democracy. No, royal wars of kings. The motive for those wars were, to a large extent, some sort of inheritance disputes with comparatively little involvement of the civilian population. Democratic wars, beginning with the French Revolution, and then of course with World War I and World War II, democratic wars are really national wars. They introduced for the first time the draft. That is, since all people allegedly under democracy rule themselves and it is their state, everybody has now the obligation to participate in the war. Even the civilian population gets drawn into the war. The war becomes more totalitarian, more total wars than kings' wars ever were. Kings' wars were by and large because the armies were meeting on open fields and the two armies were clashing and the civilian population was by and large unaffected by it. That, of course, stopped entirely, first with the American Civil War, then already with Napoleon, before, with World War I and World War II, of course, all of these states used the draft. All people have to participate in it. Nobody can escape from participating in the war enterprise. And you realize that this tendency of states going to war and trying to enlarge their territories would ultimately only come to an end if we have a one world dominating power. It is not necessary that this, and of course this is, so to speak, the goal of the United States. Yes, the United States has something more than 150 military installations across the world in all sorts of countries. Now they're far away from reaching a position, they might never reach it. But it is important to recognize that there is a tendency in that direction. So this is the second story that concerns the centralization of state power, with, as we can easily imagine, with the logical endpoint of having a world state, a world government. And let me just make one point, I'll come back to that later on again. While there are some people who think that this would be, even some philosophers thought, that would be the perfect situation if we have just one world state. It is a big mistake to think that. Because if you have one world state, then you would have the same tax structure and the same legislation, the same regulation structure all across the globe, with almost no possibility of people voting with their feet, of running away from a place in search of something that is better. And since people cannot run away from it, this one world state would have practically no problems anymore on cracking down more and more on their own population, because after all, they have no alternatives. They have to stay where they are. And all places are taxed and regulated in the same way. Now I come to the third part of the story, which again runs parallel to the ones that I already talked about up until now, and complete the picture. And that concerns the development of money. Money emerges in the market as a result of the division of labor in which people engage. Money is defined as a common means of exchange. That is, it is the most easily saleable and the most widely accepted good of all goods to facilitate exchange. There's no other good that is accepted by as many people as easily as money, and there's no other good that can be sold as easily as money. Originally, money is a commodity, some real good that has taken on this function of being the most easily exchangeable of all goods. Of course, states immediately discovered that it would be of utmost importance for them, that is, to increase the power and the mightiness of states, to somehow get their hands on money. Now, how did they do this? The first thing is they monopolized the minting of gold coins and silver coins or whatever was in use. And by monopolizing it, that is, only I in this territory can produce gold coins or silver coins. By monopolizing it, they then did what is called coin clipping. They simply said, send me your coins, and I'll make a new picture on the coins, the new king, new picture, and then took some of the gold content and silver content out of it, gave the same number of coins back to the people, but what they took out, the gold that they took out, or the silver that they took out of each one of these coins, were additional amounts of money that they kept for themselves. So the purchasing power of money was reduced, and the government, the states, produced money by stealing from the existing coins. Now, people eventually discover this sort of stuff. The next step was, because people don't always schlep around gold coins and silver coins, there existed also something that is called money substitutes. That is, tickets that entitled you to a certain amount of money. Were easier to carry around. It's just pieces, tickets. You don't have to have your pockets full of heavy gold coins or so, just tickets, but the tickets were titles to gold coins or silver coins. So then they monopolized the issue of tickets. At the beginning, various banks and so forth issued their own tickets. And each of these banks then saw to it whenever you presented a ticket, then they had the gold or silver to which the tickets entitled you. So now the tickets are monopolized. Only government-issued tickets can be used in order to be redeemed into gold and silver coins. And the next step in this process was, you have to get rid of gold coins entirely and only do with tickets. Now, this process has been somewhat complicated, and I will not go into all the details how this process happened. But all states typically went at some point, usually during wartime, off the gold standard or off the silver standard, and said, look, we keep all the gold, you give us all the gold, you give us all the silver. If you don't do that, we will punish you, and you get tickets for it. But we will no longer redeem these tickets into gold or silver. Again, this was a lengthy process that ended in 1971. In 1971, the last tie to gold was cut. Until 1971, it was possible for, at least for foreign central banks, to come to the United States and say, here I have 35, here I have paper dollars, 35 of them, they entitle me to an ounce of gold. But the United States had printed so many paper tickets, so many paper dollars, that they were incapable of paying gold out according to the agreement that they had made. And it was President Nixon in the United States who in 1971 said, we are off the gold standard completely. From now on, you can keep your paper tickets, and we keep the gold. You realize that once you are in this position, where there is absolutely no tie to any commodity anymore, then you can increase the amount of money at will. Nowadays you can even just press a button and double, triple, quadruple the amount of money in existence. Obviously you cannot do that if you're on a gold or on a silver standard. Now, what is important to realize here is an increase in the amount of money in existence does not make society richer. It just reduces the purchasing power of each unit of money. If by printing up paper money you could make society better off, then ask yourself, why is there still a poor country in the world? Even the craziest countries in the world can print any amount of paper money that they want. Why is there still a poor person on earth if simply by increasing the amount of money in existence, wealth would be created? And the answer is that cannot be done. But if you ask any central banker in the world, they all believe in this nonsense. You read in the paper every day. It's like quantitative easing. That means nothing else but more money will be printed and the purchasing power of each unit will decrease. But by printing money, while you cannot make society as a whole richer, what you can do is you can make those people richer who get the money first. Because those people who get the money first can still buy with that new money at the old low prices. And then as that money ripples through the economy and prices go up, those people who then get the money very late, they are paying higher prices already for everything. So there is an income redistribution taking place from those who get the money first, who are the ones who benefit from it, and harmed are those people who get the money last. Those people, for instance, who are on fixed incomes. If you are on fixed income and the purchasing power of money declines, you are then screwed. And then the answer is, who is the one who always gets the money first? And the answer is, who gets the money first? First the central bank that print it. and they are governmental institutions. And then the main clients of the central banks, those are the big private banks. And then the main clients of these private banks. But none of that is you and me. So if people somehow complain about how the inequality of incomes is always rising, one major reason for this is precisely this constant increase in the amount of money in existence. Now, bringing the story to an end, here and money again leads us back to what I talked before about war and imperialism. The most powerful country is also the one that produces what is called the reserve currency. The US dollar is the reserve currency used by almost all countries. The Americans printing dollars and dollars and dollars, and the other countries who sell goods to the United States, earning dollars, don't always just use these dollars in order to buy or invest things in the United States. They keep it as reserves, as the basis of their own currencies. Foreigners who sell things to the United States are paid with paper, so to speak, and the Americans receive actual goods. So American consumption is to a large extent financed by people in other countries, which we might call monetary imperialism. Again, currently there is still one problem even for the Americans. That is, the dollar is not the only paper currency in the world. There still exist other currencies, the euro, Japanese yen, Russian ruble. And if the Americans would overdo it with their money printing, then the danger might be that people move to other currencies. So there is then a tendency to eliminate also this competition against other currencies. And one attempt, for instance, one big step in that direction was, for instance, the establishment of the euro. Before the euro was established, around 2000, there were still other competing strong currencies, like the German mark, for instance. The German mark was not particularly strong because any German virtues, but Germany had suffered twice from hyperinflation because they lost the war twice. And because of that experience, the Germans were a little bit more aware of the fact that inflation is a danger. And because of that, the German central bank was relatively modest in its amount of mark printing. The Americans did not like that and promoted the establishment of the European Central Bank. And the European Central Bank, there you have Spaniards, Italians, Greek people sitting on the board of the European Central Bank, and all these countries were easy money countries. So the euro is a far weaker currency than the German mark was before. And the best, from the point of view of American interests, would be, of course, if the entire world would go on a dollar standard. Now, again, as I said, there is this tendency toward a world government, and there is a tendency to establish a world paper currency. A world paper currency would be, of course, a currency that would be more inflationary than anything you have ever seen before. Because you would not have to be afraid that, because there's only one currency left, that it somehow falls in value against other currencies which curtail your own temptation to print more and more and more. So I'm also not sure that there will eventually come about this one world paper currency, just as I'm not sure that there will in the end come about a world state. But one must be aware, in order to understand the current world, that these two tendencies are underway, that they are constantly forces, influential forces, that work in this direction. What I have told you so far has a certain amount of similarity with the Marxist theory of social development and of history. I realize that you're mostly relatively young people, so you might not even be well versed in Marxist theory anymore. I am much older than you. I just turned 70 this year. I had first-hand experience of communism. My mother had been expropriated in East Germany by the Russians. I was born in West Germany, but most of my relatives lived in the East. So I have seen firsthand the mess that socialism caused, the desperate impoverishment of people. And I have, of course, studied. I was a lefty when I was young. I have studied Marxist theory. I probably know more about Marxist theory than most or any of you. I want to make you aware of a certain similarity of what I said to what the Marxists said and point out what their major mistake was. The Marxist theory is also something, there is exploitation going on. The exploitation is exploitation by the capitalists, they exploit the workers. Now, there existed an exploitation theory and a class theory long before Marx. It was a liberal or Austrian exploitation and exploitation theory. That is, the state are the exploiting organizations. Taxation is exploitation. The interests of the worker and the capitalist are harmonious. The better the company goes, the higher the wages of workers will become. It is a voluntary association. If a worker doesn't want to work for them, he doesn't have to work for them. But there is exploitation in the world. Exploitation is taxation. And then the Marxists, there is a concentration of firms. That firms become bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until there's only one global firm left, so to speak. Yeah, but it is not firms that get bigger and bigger and bigger. It is states get bigger and bigger. The concentration does take place, but it is not the concentration of private companies. It is the concentration of states to ever larger size. So what then can we hope for? What we can hope for is for a process of decentralization, of ever smaller units on the way to a society without a state completely. That is, the European Union is a disaster. The Brexit was a good idea. Germany should get out. The provinces in Germany should get out. In many speeches in Europe, I I have coined, so to speak, the phrase, what we need is a Europe of 1,000 Liechtensteins. Liechtenstein has 36,000 inhabitants. In Liechtenstein, the Prince of Liechtenstein allows these 6 or 7 villages which compose Liechtenstein to each secede from Liechtenstein to become independent of Liechtenstein, or to join Austria, or to join Switzerland, whatever they want. Why would that be good? Why should we promote secessionist movements or decentralization? Because if we have states at all, and as long as we have any states at all, it is best to have as many of them as possible, because then they have to compete for people to stay there and not move to other places. They have to treat their people in a nice way, otherwise they simply disappear. Small states are also less likely to engage in warlike activities. Small states also are almost forced to engage in free trade with the rest of the world. Because imagine that a state like Liechtenstein with 36,000 people would say, we do protectionist measures. We don't want any foreign goods come in here. The population would be dead in a week or two. They must engage in free trade. On the other hand, if you have a huge state like the United States, if they say, okay, we build, so to speak, a trade wall all around the United States, it would, of course, lower their standards of living, but not as dramatically and not as immediately as in small places, because they still have a large internal market with thousands and millions of firms within the territory of the United States that can produce almost everything, maybe not as efficient and not as quickly and not as good as the products would be if they would also trade with the rest of the world. But they could deal with it for a while. And as I said before, the smaller the states are, the more difficult it becomes for people to simply engage in, I steal from my neighbor by voting for this and that, because people know each other and there will be more social control. So the goal of libertarians on the way to the goal of a completely stateless society is, first, we have to work as hard as we can with as good arguments as we can come up with for a process of decentralization or even secession. I thank you very much.